Hi, I'm Marianne Cole. Last Friday night, I walked into my husband's 20th anniversary company gala with a leather clutch and the navy dress he chose, and walked out with my dignity in pieces. My cheeks burned under the chandelier light, my pulse pounding so loud I could barely hear the jazz trio. Behind me, Jenna's voice sliced through the laughter. Useless wife, everyone knows. Paul glanced at me once, then turned back to his wine. His hand rested on her chair. And not one person stopped to say my name. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was it wasn't just one night. It was 18 years of quiet labor, financial sacrifice, and erasure that all came crashing down in that steakhouse. The air inside smelled of charred ribeye and sweet vanilla perfume. Gold light spilled across the tables, catching on crystal glasses, making the room look warmer than it felt. Every step in my heels sounded too loud, too sharp, as I walked past clusters of people who knew me, knew my face, but not my story. I spotted Paul at the center table, the one he always reserved for investors and people he wanted to impress. He leaned back in his chair, jacket open, speaking with the kind of confidence I once believed was earned. His laugh rose above the room like a spotlight, and every head turned toward him. Not toward me. I waited for him to acknowledge me, to wave me over, to stand and say, "This is Marianne, my wife. She's the reason I made it here." He didn't. He sipped his wine, glanced my way, and placed his hand on Jenna's chair like it belonged there. She tilted her head, catching the light in her perfect blonde hair, and smiled at me in a way that wasn't kindness. The clutch in my hand grew slick. The seam bit into my palm. I could feel the thrum of my own pulse there, an angry drumbeat I couldn't quiet. My mouth tasted metallic, though I hadn't touched the wine. A waiter slid past me, the scent of orange peel and champagne catching in the air. Someone laughed hard at a joke I didn't hear. Somewhere in the corner, the jazz trio's upright bass kept a slow, steady rhythm, like the seconds stretching too long. I thought about all the times I'd been in rooms like this. When Paul was just starting out, when I still wore my teacher's badge during the week and stayed up late balancing his books on our kitchen table. Back then, we'd arrived together. Back then, I was part of the story. Now I was a shadow. I tried to remember the last time he'd introduced me to someone new. Months. A year. The last time we'd even been to dinner alone. I could see the answer in the way his eyes slid past mine. Jenna leaned toward him, whispering something. His smile widened. She touched his forearm like she owned the right. I wanted to turn away, to leave before the heat in my chest became tears in my eyes. But I stayed, standing there under the warm lights that felt cold on my skin. No one at that table looked at me. No one asked if I needed a seat. No one remembered that I'd been here since day one. Hiring staff, handling payroll, smoothing over supplier disputes while Paul took the credit. I stepped back, my heel catching on the edge of the carpet. A soft gasp escaped before I could stop it. The sound drew a glance from the waiter again, his expression unreadable. He kept walking. The room felt smaller now, tighter. My breath shortened. I turned toward the exit, the heavy glass doors reflecting a distorted version of me. Flushed cheeks, tense jaw, eyes that didn't look like mine anymore. Outside, Denver's night air hit like a shock. Cool, crisp, smelling faintly of rain on concrete. Streetlights cast gold pools across the wet pavement. My reflection followed me in each one, a reminder of the stranger I'd become. I stood there for a moment, clutch still in hand, watching couples pass by, laughing easily, untouched by the kind of betrayal that makes you question your own worth. I thought about going back in, about forcing my way to that table and making Paul look me in the eye. But what would I say? That I was tired of being erased, that I'd traded my own ambitions for his spotlight? He wouldn't hear it. Not here. Not now. Instead, I turned toward the curb, my heels clicking against the wet sidewalk. Each step felt like a beat in some slow, inevitable march toward something I couldn't yet name. I reached the corner, the glow from the steakhouse fading behind me, replaced by the dim, steady hum of the city at night. And in that hum, a thought formed. Sharp, clear, and impossible to ignore. I still had leverage. The kind he couldn't take from me without my consent. But that's a story for later. So, what do you think happened after I stepped into the cool Denver night? Before we dive in, tell me. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. I read everyone. I didn't always feel like a stranger in his story. 18 years ago, Paul's office was our dining table in a cramped duplex in Aurora. The wallpaper was faded, the heat came from a rattling vent in the floor, and the only desk we had was the oak table my parents gave us as a wedding gift. I'd come home from teaching third grade with chalk dust still on my sleeves. Paul would be hunched over invoices, calculator by his elbow, pencil between his teeth. If I land this bid, we're set for months. He'd say without looking up. Back then, I believed him. Believed in us. I remember the winter night he told me he wanted to go all in. The snow had just started falling, soft flakes catching in the porch light. He spread the papers out. Contracts, estimates, rough sketches of buildings he swore he could win bids for. We just need cash flow to get through the first 6 months. He said, eyes bright, hands moving fast. That's when I offered the house. My house. The little 2-bedroom I'd bought before we met, with the pink dogwood in the yard and the creaky porch swing. We sold it in March. The day we signed, I ran my hand along the banister one last time, the wood smooth from years of touch. We moved into the duplex the next week, smaller rooms, lower ceilings. But it felt like a beginning. I learned QuickBooks from scratch. Stayed up late balancing numbers while Paul slept, the glow of the laptop the only light in the kitchen. I made coffee at 5 a.m., packed his lunch in wax paper, and sent him out with a kiss and a pep talk. He'd call at lunch to tell me how the meeting went, and I'd jot notes on a legal pad while stirring a pot of soup for dinner. On Saturdays, we'd drive to job sites together. The smell of sawdust and fresh paint clung to his jacket when we came home. He'd lay out blueprints across the table, and we'd lean over them like kids with a treasure map. I kept track of every supplier, every delivery date, every overdue payment. No one else saw it, but I was there. Every bid, every handshake, every late-night panic, when a payment was late and payroll was due. When he won his first big contract, I baked a chocolate cake in our tiny kitchen. The frosting split down the middle, but he grinned like it was the best thing he'd ever tasted. In those early years, I wasn't just his wife. I was his partner. At least, that's what I thought. The turning point came so quietly I almost missed it. It was the summer we finally moved out of the duplex. Paul had landed a commercial contract downtown, a 10-story office renovation. And suddenly there was more cash than bills. We bought a house in a new development on the edge of Aurora. Wide streets, trimmed lawns, neighbors who waved when you drove by. Paul picked the corner lot. Plenty of space for barbecues. He said, imagining company picnics and investor parties before the drywall was even up. I decorated the home office for him. Dark wood desk, leather chair, framed certificates. I made sure the bookshelves were stocked with binders of contracts, each tab labeled in my neat handwriting. But somewhere in those months, my name stopped showing up. Invoices went out under Cole Commercial Services, Paul Cole, CEO. The business cards dropped, and Mariana, from the footer. When I asked why, he smiled and said, streamlines the brand. I told myself it didn't matter. The money was ours. The life we were building was ours. I still handled payroll, still soothed angry clients, still caught errors before they cost us. But when people shook his hand, they looked past me. When they said, your company's doing well, they meant his. One afternoon, I overheard him on the phone in the home office. The door was half shut. His voice was warm, deliberate. It's all me now. I run every part of it. He laughed softly, a sound I used to hear after midnight when we'd talk about our dreams. I stood there in the hallway, the scent of fresh coffee drifting from the kitchen, my hands damp from rinsing mugs. Something small cracked inside me. Not loud, not dramatic, just a shift. After that, the hours between us grew longer. He traveled more, came home later. When I suggested joining him at a networking dinner, he said, "It's mostly business talk, you'd be bored." I wasn't bored. I was excluded. Years passed in that rhythm. Me behind the scenes, him in the spotlight. The gap between those two places widened, but I kept crossing it for him. Every time I thought about pulling back, I remembered the winter night on the porch, the papers spread out under the glow, the man who said we just needed 6 months. Maybe that's why, standing outside the steakhouse last Friday night, I wasn't surprised by the silence. I'd been living in it for years. What I didn't know, what he didn't see, was that silence has a way of collecting power. And I had been collecting for a very long time. Monday morning, the hangover wasn't from wine. I opened my inbox, still in my robe, coffee cooling on the desk. The subject line was in bold, "Friday's dinner recap." It was from Jenna. She'd sent it to the entire staff, copying Paul and the investor list. Halfway down, between a bullet point about dessert and a note on future expansion, there it was. Thanks to everyone who made the evening a success, especially our team members who actually keep things running. I read it twice. 3 times. The word, actually, sat there like a knife. The cursor blinked on the screen. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. My first instinct was to reply, all with a list of every payroll I'd processed, every crisis I'd solved, every late-night supplier call I'd taken while Paul was out networking. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I clicked the attachment she'd included. A photo, Paul, standing beside her at the podium, arm around her shoulders. The background blurred with light and champagne flutes. His smile, wide, polished, was the same one he'd worn the night I sold my house. My stomach tightened. The coffee tasted bitter now. I pushed the mug away. Down the hall, Paul's office door was closed. I could hear the low murmur of his voice on a call. I walked toward it anyway, the carpet soft under my bare feet, the air cooler here. I knocked. "Come in," he said without looking up from his laptop. I held up my phone, the email open. "Did you read this?" He scanned the screen, shrugged. "It's just Jenna being Jenna." "She sent it to the entire staff," I said, keeping my voice level. "And the investors." Paul leaned back in his chair. "You're overreacting. Everyone knows what you do for the company." I almost laughed. "Do they? Because the woman you're defending just erased me in one sentence." His jaw tightened. "Marianne, this is business. Don't take it personally." I stood there, the hum of his desktop filling the space between us. Through the blinds, a slice of Colorado winter sky showed, flat gray, no sun. My hands itched to slam the laptop shut. Instead, I stepped back. "If this is business," I said, "then let's treat it like business." Paul's brow furrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You'll find out," I told him, turning toward the door. My pulse was steady now, the way it gets when you've made a decision and all that's left is to see it through. In the kitchen, I poured the cold coffee down the drain. The dark swirl disappeared, leaving the sink empty. Clean. Ready for something new. I thought stepping away from Paul's office would calm me down. It didn't. By mid-afternoon, the silence in the house felt heavier than any argument. I tried to focus on invoicing, but my eyes kept drifting back to Jenna's email, still open on my screen like a dare I hadn't answered. Around 3, my phone buzzed. A text from Sandra. "You see the company-wide email?" Company-wide. My stomach dropped. I'd been so focused on the investor list, I hadn't considered the full reach. "Yes," I typed back. "We'll talk later." But the damage wasn't waiting for later. At 4:30. I went to pick up some catering receipts from the office. As I stepped through the glass door, the front desk receptionist glanced up, then quickly back at her computer. A pair of junior project managers walked past, their conversation cutting off mid-sentence. I told myself I was imagining it. Until I reached the break room. 2 employees sat at the table, laughing over something on one of their phones. One of them, Greg, barely a year out of college, looked up at me and smirked. "Hey, Marianne. You here for the free snacks? The other one chuckled, eyes flicking back to the phone. It hit harder than I expected. Not the words, but the casualness, like it was normal. Like my work, my time, my presence. All reduced to a joke they could pass around with their afternoon coffee. I set the receipts on the counter and left without saying a word. Outside, the wind cut sharp across the parking lot, carrying the smell of exhaust and melting snow. My heels clicked too loud on the pavement, each step landing with the dull ache of humiliation. Driving home, I gripped the wheel tighter than necessary. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked the same as it had that morning. Same hair, same makeup, same coat. But I felt older. Smaller. At a red light, I replayed Greg's smirk, the receptionist's quick glance away, the photo of Paul and Jenna at the podium. A chain of moments linking together into something that felt deliberate. Coordinated. By the time I pulled into our driveway, the last of the daylight had faded. The porch light cast a soft circle on the front step, catching the frost along the railing. I stood there for a second before unlocking the door, listening to the faint hum of traffic in the distance. Inside, the house was quiet except for the ticking of the kitchen clock. I set my purse down, poured a glass of water, and stared out the window at the street. They thought I was background. They thought I was harmless. They thought I would stay silent. They'd find out soon enough how wrong they were. It happened on a Tuesday morning. I was standing at the ATM outside our bank, coat collar pulled up against the wind. The air smelled faintly of diesel from the delivery trucks lining the street. My gloves made the buttons harder to press, but I'd done this 100 times before. Just a quick withdrawal before meeting Sandra for lunch. I slid in the card. Entered the PIN. Selected. Checking. The screen flashed. Insufficient funds. I frowned. Hit. Cancel. Tried the savings account instead. Same message. A gust of wind cut down the sidewalk, rattling the paper cup in the trash bin beside me. I took off one glove, pressed the button slower, double, checking each digit. My breath clouded the glass as I leaned closer to read the balance. The numbers didn't make sense. Too low to be a mistake. I pulled out my phone right there, fingers stiff in the cold, and opened the banking app. The last withdrawal was yesterday. $10,000. The memo field just said, vendor payment. Except it wasn't a vendor I recognized. I scrolled further. More charges. $400 at a boutique hotel downtown. $2,000 at a jewelry store in Cherry Creek. None of it mine. Behind me, someone cleared their throat, an older man waiting in line. I stepped aside, my heart pounding against the zipper of my coat. My thumb hovered over Paul's name in my contacts, but I didn't press it. Instead, I walked into the branch. The carpet muffled my steps, but I could hear the faint hiss of the heat vents. A woman in a navy blazer looked up from the counter. Morning. How can I help you? I set my card on the desk. There's a problem with my accounts. She typed quickly, eyes scanning the screen. It looks like there have been several large withdrawals and charges. Do you want to freeze the cards?
Yes,
I said. The word came out sharper than I meant. Do you need to speak with the other account holder before? No. Hey, her eyebrows lifted slightly, but she nodded. We can issue new cards today. Funds from future deposits can be rerouted to a different account if you'd like. I looked past her, toward the row of offices with glass doors. Paul's name was on the loan documents that hung framed in one of them. My name wasn't. Yes, I said again. Rewrote everything to a new account. In my name only. She printed forms. The paper was warm from the machine. I signed without reading every line, my pen leaving sharp grooves in the page. When I stepped back outside, the wind felt colder, the sky flatter. The trucks were gone, replaced by a bus idling at the corner. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Paul, calling. I let it go to voicemail. By the time I got home, the voicemail had been joined by 3 missed calls and a text. Call me ASAP. Zane, no apology, no explanation. Just an order. I set my bag on the counter and let the phone buzz itself silent. The refrigerator hummed in the background, the only steady sound in the house. I poured a glass of water, my hands still cold from the wind, and replayed the numbers in my head. 10,000. 2,000. 400. All gone without a word. I opened my laptop and logged into the accounts again, scrolling transaction by transaction. The boutique hotel charge was followed by dinner at a high-end steakhouse. On the same night I'd been home alone eating leftover soup, 2 more entries for wine deliveries. A spa package at a resort in Aspen. I could almost see it. Jenna's laugh echoing off polished marble floors. Paul's hand on her back as they checked in. My signature, buried somewhere in the paperwork that gave him access to every dollar. I clicked print statement and watched page after page slide from the printer tray. The paper smelled faintly of warm ink, each line a record of how far my trust had fallen. Halfway through the stack, my phone rang again. This time, I answered. "What the hell, Marianne?" His voice was tight, already defensive. "I could ask you the same. You froze the accounts. Do you have any idea what that does to payroll?" "I do," I said evenly. "I also know exactly what you spent $10,000 on yesterday." A pause. The kind where you can hear someone's mind scramble for footing. "That was a vendor." "No, Paul. Vendors don't check into boutique hotels under your name and hers." Silence. Just the faint static of the line. "You're making this into something it's not," he said finally. "Jenna's been helping me with client relations. We meet with people outside the office all the time. And buy jewelry for them. That was a gift for a client's wife." I almost laughed. "Do you hear yourself? Look, we can talk about this tonight. Just unfreeze the accounts before then." "No," I said. "From now on, my income and my investments go into my account. Alone." His tone shifted, a low growl under the words. "Don't do something you'll regret." I ended the call without answering. The house felt too still after his voice cut out. I gathered the printed statements into a manila folder and slid it into the desk drawer with my other important documents. Birth certificate, house deed, the original paperwork showing my 15% stake in the company. It had been years since I'd looked at that folder. But as I closed the drawer, I realized something I hadn't let myself admit until now. Every signature on those pages gave me more leverage than Paul wanted to believe. And leverage, used quietly, can move more than just money. I shut the laptop. The light from the winter sky slipped through the blinds, painting thin stripes across the floor. For the first time in months, my heartbeat slowed. Let him think I was just angry. Let him think this was about hurt feelings. He had no idea what was coming. People imagine betrayal as a single blow. In reality, it's a slow bleed. By the end of the week, the phone calls had shifted. Friends I used to meet for coffee suddenly couldn't find the time. The project managers at the office stopped looping me in on updates. Even my sister, who once called me every Sunday night, sent a text that felt rehearsed. "I'm sure you and Paul will work it out. I don't want to take sides, Das." The absence was louder than any argument. On Thursday morning, I drove to the grocery store for milk and bread. The air outside was sharp enough to sting my nose. Inside, the smell of ground coffee and warm bread curled through the aisles. I turned in to produce and nearly collided with one of Paul's long-time suppliers, a man I'd once negotiated a discount with when his delivery truck broke down. "Marianne," he said, smiling thinly. "I hear you're stepping back from the business." The words landed like pebbles in my shoe. Small, but impossible to ignore. I forced a smile. "Who told you that?" "Oh, you know how people talk." He glanced toward the oranges, suddenly interested in the display. I moved on, my cart rattling under my hands. It wasn't just Paul and Jenna controlling the narrative now. It was everyone with a stake in the version of events that kept me invisible. That afternoon, Sandra showed up unannounced. The sound of her knock, 3 quick raps, was a relief. I opened the door to the scent of her cinnamon gum and the familiar scrape of her boots on the entryway tile. "You look like hell," she said, stepping inside. She didn't mean it cruelly. Sandra's always been like that, blunt enough to slice through any polite pretending. We sat at the kitchen table, the late winter light falling in pale rectangles across the wood. She reached for the manila folder I'd pulled from the drawer earlier in the week. 15%, she said, flipping through the papers. Bought with your money, your house sale, your inheritance. And you've been signing off on operations for 18 years. I nodded. And somehow, I'm the useless wife. She leaned back, her chair creaking. That's not useless. That's ownership. Control. On paper, I said. In court, she corrected. I sipped my tea. It had gone lukewarm. The taste was flat now, but I didn't get up to warm it. Paul thinks freezing the accounts was me being emotional. Sandra's eyes narrowed. Let him keep thinking that. Emotional women are easier to underestimate. We sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the refrigerator filling the space. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past, tires hissing over slush. Sandra finally pushed the folder back toward me. You have more than he does right now, Marianne. He's got noise, appearances, gossip. You have proof. And proof lasts. Her words settled in like a weight that was somehow lighter than the one I'd been carrying. For the first time since the steakhouse, I felt the faint edge of possibility. The following days blurred into a loop of quiet mornings and colder evenings. Paul stayed at the office later and later. When he did come home, he moved through the house like a guest. Jacket still on, phone pressed to his ear, eyes avoiding mine. The clink of ice in his glass replaced conversation. I stopped asking about his day. He stopped pretending to ask about mine. The phone barely rang anymore, except for robocalls and Sandra. She called every couple of days, usually in the late afternoon when the light turned amber and the shadows in the living room grew long. Her voice carried an edge of humor, but underneath it I could hear the worry. One night, I scrolled through old photos on my laptop. Company picnics, holiday parties, charity galas. In every shot, Paul stood front and center, smiling at someone just out of frame. I was always a step to the side, handing someone a clipboard, arranging place cards, half turned toward a conversation that didn't make the final cut. It struck me then invisibility isn't sudden. It's incremental. On Saturday, I decided to run errands just to leave the house. The sky was the pale blue of late winter, brittle and thin. At the dry cleaners, the woman behind the counter glanced at my ticket, then at me. "Oh, you're Paul's wife?" she said. The way she said it was different now, more curiosity than recognition. When I left, the wind stung my eyes. I wasn't sure if the moisture on my lashes was from the cold or something else. That night, I ate dinner alone at the kitchen table. The clock over the stove ticked loud in the silence. Across from me, Paul's chair sat pushed in neatly, its absence more pointed than any empty room. I found myself glancing at the manila folder on the counter, the edges slightly curled now from how often I'd opened it. Around 9, Sandra texted, "You holding up?" And I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying, "Trying." 2 minutes later, she called. "Trying is better than quitting," she said. I could hear the faint sound of a baseball game in the background. You know what I think? Every time they push you further out, they're leaving you more room to move. Move where? I asked. Toward whatever comes next. I didn't answer right away. My gaze fell to the folder again, to the black ink on white paper that was more than a stack of documents. It was a ledger of everything I'd put in, and a map of what I could still take out. After we hung up, I turned off the lights and stood at the window. The street outside was quiet, the lamppost throwing a cone of yellow onto the driveway. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once, then stopped. The kind of stillness that comes before something breaks. And I realized I was done waiting for the next blow. The silence had already made its choice. The invitation arrived on cream cardstock with gold lettering. A Cole Commercial Services Partner Appreciation Night. Paul left it on the counter without a word, next to the pile of mail. No mention of me coming. No mention of who else would be there. I went anyway. The event was at a rooftop bar in downtown Denver, the kind with glass walls that made the skyline look close enough to touch. The elevator ride up was lined with mirrors. My reflection stared back at me from every angle. I'd chosen a black dress. Simple, sharp, impossible to ignore. If Paul wanted to pretend I wasn't part of this world, I would make pretending harder. The doors opened to the hum of conversation and the faint scent of citrus from the bar's signature cocktails. Music floated from hidden speakers, something jazzy but fast enough to keep the mood lively. I stepped onto the polished concrete floor and scanned the crowd. Paul was near the center, surrounded by a half-circle of men in tailored suits and women in dresses that shimmered under the pendant lights. His hand rested, again, on the back of Jenna's chair. She was in crimson silk, her hair curled loose over her shoulders. They were both laughing at something the man across from them had said. I walked toward them, the click of my heels sharp against the floor. Heads turned. A few people smiled politely, the kind you give when you're not sure if you should know someone. My pulse kept pace with the beat of the music. When I reached the group, Paul glanced up. "Marianne," he said, his tone neutral. "Didn't expect you tonight." "I'm a partner, aren't I?" I said, keeping my voice even. A flicker of discomfort crossed his face before he recovered. "Of course. Everyone, this is Paul's wife." Jenna finished for him, smiling as if she'd done me a favor. "She helps out sometimes." The words landed like a slap. I saw it in the quick exchange of glances, the almost smiles around the table. Helps out. As if 18 years of work could be boiled down to a hobby. I took a slow breath, tasting the hint of lime in the air from the cocktails. "I manage the company's operations," I said, letting my eyes rest on each face. "Payroll, vendor contracts, compliance. Every number that keeps this business standing." No one challenged me, but no one spoke either. The pause was long enough for the music to seem louder. Paul cleared his throat. "Well, Marianne, we were just talking about the expansion into Fort Collins." "That's funny," I said, "because I haven't seen a single contract for it." His smile tightened. Jenna tilted her head, Fox, sympathetic. "It's been busy. We didn't want to bother you." I felt the weight of the moment settle, heavy as the glass in my hand. This was the stage they'd chosen. A public table, an audience, and the kind of polite cruelty that's harder to fight than an outright insult. I set my drink down. "Then, maybe you should stop using my share of the company to fund projects I'm not allowed to know about." The silence after that was sharper than the music, sharper than the city lights glittering behind the glass. I smiled once, just enough to make them shift in their seats. Then I turned and walked toward the edge of the rooftop, letting the cold night air hit my face. "So, if you were standing there, hearing someone erase nearly 2 decades of your work in front of a room full of strangers, would you fight back right then or wait for the right moment?" I stayed at the railing longer than I needed to. The Denver skyline spread out in front of me, lights flickering against the black glass of high-rises. Far below, traffic moved like veins of red and white, steady and distant. The air smelled faintly of smoke from a nearby fire pit, mixed with the crisp bite of winter. Behind me, laughter started again. Forced at first, then louder, like nothing had happened. I took another sip of my drink, the ice now melting into a thin layer of water. A familiar voice joined the noise. "Sandra." I turned to see her weaving through the crowd, her coat still draped over her arm, eyes scanning until they found me. "Thought you might need backup," she said, her breath visible in the chill. "I didn't invite you," I said, but the corner of my mouth betrayed me. "You don't have to," she replied. "I can smell a Jenna from 3 blocks away." We stood side by side for a minute, watching the room from a distance. Paul was leaning in close to an older man in a gray suit, his smile fixed, his hands still on the back of Jenna's chair. She threw her head back at something he said, touching his arm like the punchline was personal. Looks like they're selling something, Sandra murmured. They've been selling me out for months, I said. Her gaze stayed on them. Then stop letting them set the price. I let that settle in my chest, heavy but right. Before I could answer, Paul noticed us. He excused himself from the group and made his way over, the smile gone now. "Marianne, can we talk privately?" he said. "Hair's fine," I answered. He glanced at Sandra, then back to me. "You're making a scene." I tilted my head toward the table. "No, Paul. That's where the scene was made." His jaw worked, but no words came out. Sandra stepped in just enough to make her presence felt. "She's not the one diminishing the company's leadership in public," she said, her voice steady. Paul's eyes narrowed. "This is between us." "No," I said. "This is between you, me, and the people you're trying to convince I don't exist." A few heads turned toward us. I didn't care. Let them watch. Paul's hand twitched toward my arm, but he thought better of it. "We'll discuss this at home." "I'm done having those discussions in private," I said. His face flushed. For a second, I saw the man from our early days. The one who hated losing, who would twist the truth rather than admit defeat. He straightened his jacket, glanced at the onlookers, and walked back to the table without another word. Sandra exhaled slowly. "Well," she said, "that's one way to plant a flag." "I'm not planting a flag," I said. "I'm marking the battlefield." We stayed until the cold finally drove us downstairs. The elevator ride was quiet except for the hum of the cables. In the mirrored walls, I caught my reflection. Still standing straight, still holding my chin level, but with something new in my eyes. Not just anger, intention. Outside, the night air was sharper. We walked to our cars without talking, our breath clouding in front of us. I drove home with the radio off, the city lights fading in my rearview. The silence wasn't heavy this time. It was the kind of silence you get right before making your move. The morning after the rooftop event, I woke before sunrise. The house was still dark, the only sound the faint hum of the furnace. I padded into the kitchen, the tile cold under my bare feet, and poured coffee into a mug that had a faint chip along the rim. Steam curled into the air, carrying the bitter, comforting smell I needed to steady myself. Paul's car was already gone. I stood for a long moment at the kitchen table, looking at the manila folder I'd left there the night before. The edges were worn now, the paper inside slightly bowed from the weight of years. I slid it toward me and opened it. Receipts, contracts, copies of checks with my signature alongside his, and then, buried beneath the rest, a thin envelope I hadn't touched in years. The paper had yellowed slightly, the flap sealed with old adhesive that gave way with a soft tear. Inside was the original purchase agreement for my 15% stake in Cole Commercial Services. My name printed clearly on the ownership line. Not Mrs. Paul Cole, not spouse. Just me. The date was there too. March 14, 2007. The day we closed on the sale of my little house. The same day I'd watched strangers carry out my dining table and my grandmother's china cabinet. My handwriting marked the amount transferred from my account into the company's. And beneath it, the notarized statement, "A funds provided solely by Marianne Cole from personal assets acquired prior to marriage." I traced the line with my finger. Proof. Not just memory, not just an old story I could tell myself in the dark. Proof that my stake wasn't a gift, wasn't charity. It was an investment. Mine. The sound of the garage door from across the street pulled me back. I slid the papers into a fresh folder, the cardboard stiff against my palm. This one I wouldn't leave lying around. By the time Sandra arrived mid-morning, I had the folder on the table between us. She leaned over it, eyes scanning quickly. 15%, she said. And no conditions on sale or transfer. He's been counting on you not looking at this. I think he's been counting on me forgetting I even have it. She smiled without humor. Well, I'd call that his first mistake. The clock on the wall ticked softly. I could hear the faint whoosh of cars passing outside, the occasional pop of the baseboard heat. It all felt too calm for what sat between us. Sandra tapped the notarized page. With this, you can sell your stake without his approval. Or you can hold it and use it as leverage. Either way, you're not powerless. Powerless. The word had been an invisible weight on my shoulders for years. I'd stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing a necklace you never take off, until the day you feel the clasp loosen. I took a long sip of coffee, the taste cooler now but grounding. I want him to know I have options. But not yet? Good, Sandra said. Let him think you're still on the defensive. I slid the folder back into my bag, the zipper closing with a sharp, final sound. Outside, the sun had climbed just high enough to throw light across the table, catching the gold threads in the fabric of my chair. It felt like the first shift of a much larger storm. The rest of the day passed in fragments. I tried to fold laundry, answer emails, chop vegetables for soup. But the folder in my bag might as well have been humming, pulling my thoughts back to it again and again. Every time I pictured Paul's face when he realized what I held, a small, dangerous satisfaction curled inside me. By late afternoon, the light outside had gone that pale, tired gray of winter. I sat at my desk with the bank statements from last week spread out in front of me. 10,000. 2,000. 400. Each number now looked like another nail in a coffin he didn't know I was building. I slid the ownership documents beside the statements. Together, they told a story no gossip or investor spin could erase. My money built this company, and my money was now being bled for someone else's comfort. The juxtaposition was stark. Black ink on white paper, two timelines meeting in the middle. Sandra called just after 5. How's it feel? She asked. Like I've been walking around with a loaded weapon I didn't know I had. You've known, she said. You just forgot where you put it. We talked logistics for 20 minutes. What selling my stake would require, how quickly it could be done, who might be interested in buying. Her voice was calm, measured, never pushing, just laying out possibilities like cards on a table. When we hung up, the quiet settled again. I could hear the faint creak of the house as the temperature dropped, the tick of the baseboard heat, the whisper of wind against the windows. I pulled the folder out one more time, this time spreading the contents across the bed. The papers looked almost fragile under the lamplight, edges curling slightly. I thought about the years they'd sat untouched in a drawer, gathering dust, while I convinced myself that loyalty meant silence. It was loyalty that had built this company, and it was silence that had let him write me out of it. I stacked the papers neatly and slipped them back into the folder, then placed it in the lockbox at the back of my closet. The metal clicked shut, final and satisfying. As I straightened up, a memory surfaced uninvited. The day Paul and I signed the incorporation papers. We'd gone out for pancakes afterward, the diner warm with the smell of butter and coffee. He'd reached across the table, squeezed my hand, and said, "We're in this together, Mare. No matter what." I wondered if he remembered saying it. I wondered if it ever meant the same thing to him that it had to me. The garage door rumbled just after 7. I left the lockbox where it was and moved to the kitchen, stirring the soup so it wouldn't look like I'd been waiting. Paul came in without taking off his coat, hanging his keys on the hook by the door. "We need to talk," he said. I met his eyes over the rim of the ladle. "We will. Just not tonight." He frowned, but I didn't give him room to argue. I turned back to the stove, the steam rising around me, hiding the small smile I couldn't quite suppress. In the other room, his phone buzzed. He picked it up without hesitation, his voice low and careful. I let the sound fade into the background, because the next move was mine. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready to take it. Sleep wouldn't come. I lay in bed staring at the faint glow of the alarm clock. 12:47 a.m., listening to the slow, uneven rhythm of Paul's breathing beside me. The room was warm, but my hands were cold. I slid them under the covers, pressing them against my ribs, trying to quiet the thud of my heart. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the folder. The crisp black ink of my name on the ownership line. The dated signature. The notarized seal. Proof that I wasn't just part of the company's history. I was part of its foundation. I turned onto my side, facing the window. Outside, the streetlight cast a circle of pale yellow on the driveway. A few dry leaves skittered across the concrete, making a faint, papery sound. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once, then stopped. The silence after was heavier than before. I thought about the years I'd traded for this life, the nights I stayed up late balancing books, while Paul slept, the mornings I drove across town to negotiate with suppliers so he could focus on strategy. All of it invisible now, erased in a single email, a single smirk, a single careless introduction. My phone was on the nightstand. I picked it up, the screen lighting the room, just enough to show Paul's outline in the bed. Sandra's last text glowed at the top, "Let me know when you're ready." Then I typed, then erased, then typed again the soon. The clock read 1:19 a.m., my eyes burned, but I didn't blink. In my mind, I replayed the rooftop scene, Jenna's hand on Paul's chair, her voice saying, "She helps out sometimes." I thought about the bank statements, the jewelry receipt, the hotel charge. Each one was a match, and I was sitting on a pile of dry kindling. Paul shifted in his sleep, mumbling something I couldn't catch. I lay still until his breathing evened again. By 2:04 a.m., I'd stopped trying to rest. I got out of bed quietly, my bare feet finding the cool wood floor. In the kitchen, I made tea, the kettle's low whistle sounding too loud in the sleeping house. The steam curled upward, carrying the faint scent of chamomile. I sat at the table with my mug between my palms, staring at the dark window. My reflection looked older, sharper. There was no fear in it now. Just a kind of stillness I hadn't felt in years. In the next room, the lockbox waited behind the closet door. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what was inside, and I knew exactly how I was going to use it. The tea cooled. The clock in the hallway chimed softly for 300 a.m. By the time the first gray light of morning touched the edge of the blinds, my mind was clear. I wasn't going to wait for another insult, another withdrawal, another moment of being pushed to the side. The decision wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It just had to be final. By sunrise, the house was still silent. I'd showered, dressed, and made coffee without waking Paul. The kitchen smelled of fresh grounds and toast. Steam rose from the mug in my hands, curling into the pale morning light. I sat at the table, not touching the toast, my mind already pacing ahead. At 7:12, Paul came downstairs. His tie was crooked, his eyes still heavy with sleep. "You're up early?" he said. "I didn't sleep much," I replied. He poured his own coffee, adding more sugar than usual, and didn't ask why. I watched him move around the kitchen, opening cabinets, sliding papers into his briefcase. Like it was just another Tuesday. And maybe for him, it was. For me, it wasn't. When the door shut behind him, the quiet felt different. Not empty. Available. I took the folder from the lockbox and laid it on the table again. My fingers traced the edges of the paper inside, not because I doubted it, but because I wanted to memorize the feel of it. This was more than documentation. It was the spine of my next move. I opened my laptop and drafted an email to Sandra. "Need to meet today. Noon." And her reply came less than a minute later. "I'll bring lunch." With that set, I turned to the bank's website. I reviewed the new account they'd opened in my name only. Clean, untouched, a blank page. I made a list of recurring deposits tied to my personal work with the company. Consulting fees, reimbursements, vendor commission percentages. Every one of them would be redirected here. I deleted my name from the shared online calendar. Then I removed my personal email from the company's mailing list. If they wanted me out of sight, I'd give them exactly what they claimed they wanted, while taking back everything they didn't know they'd lose. The kettle on the stove whistled again. I refilled my mug, the warmth seeping into my palms. Outside, the sun was higher now, catching on the frost along the fence. A delivery truck rumbled down the street, brakes sighing as it stopped 2 houses away. At exactly 11:58, Sandra pulled into the driveway. She carried a paper bag that smelled faintly of rosemary and garlic. We sat at the table, eating quickly, while I laid out the sequence I'd mapped in my head. Step 1, I said, secure my income streams. Step 2, gather every document that shows my contributions. Contracts, payroll approvals, supplier negotiations. Step 3. I paused, letting the idea sharpen before I spoke it aloud. Step 3 is letting him find out when it's too late. Sandra leaned back, chewing slowly. You're ready. I'm past ready, I said. We packed up the lunch containers, the scent of rosemary lingering in the air. Sandra left with a promise to send me the contact information for 2 lawyers she trusted. I locked the folder away again, this time slipping the key into a place Paul would never think to look. By mid-afternoon, the light in the kitchen had shifted, gold creeping across the floor. I sat with my laptop open, the cursor blinking on an empty document. The title read simply Leverage. It wasn't a to-do list. It was a record in the making. The day moved on, the clock ticking forward, but the resolve didn't fade. It stayed sharp, steady. A quiet hum beneath everything I did. When Paul's car pulled into the driveway that evening, I closed the laptop and set it aside. My face in the hallway mirror looked calm. Neutral. But I knew the truth. I wasn't waiting anymore. I'd already begun. By the end of the week, the plan had shape. It started with small, invisible steps. Moves Paul wouldn't notice until they mattered. I shifted my consulting invoices to the new account, updated the mailing address for my statements, and requested hard copies instead of email. Paper leaves a trail they can't erase. Each morning, I worked from the kitchen table, coffee steaming beside me, the manila folder always within reach. I sorted through old files, flagging anything with my signature, my initials, or my name on the header. Contracts, purchase orders, payroll approvals. Every page was another thread in the net I was weaving. Sandra came by on Wednesday with a portable scanner. We sat for hours, feeding documents through, the hum of the machine steady in the background. Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches against the window. Inside, we barely spoke. We didn't need to. Paul thought my silence meant retreat. In reality, it was the cover I needed. On Thursday, I called one of our oldest suppliers. A man named Bill who remembered the days when I was the one signing the checks. Just reviewing some records, I said lightly, and I wanted to confirm the terms of our original agreement. He laughed and told me I'd driven a harder bargain than most of Paul's clients. I made notes in the margin of my legal pad, his words another piece of proof. At night, after Paul went to bed, I'd sit in the living room with the lamp on low, reviewing the scanned files on my laptop. The glow from the screen lit only my hands and the edge of my coffee cup. I kept the volume down when saving them to the encrypted drive Sandra had set up for me. The house felt different now, less like a place I was waiting to be pushed out of, more like a quiet headquarters. I noticed details I'd ignored before, the way the front door latch stuck, unless you pulled it just right, the loose board in the upstairs hallway that creaked every time Paul walked past, the narrow drawer in the kitchen that was just deep enough to hide the flash drive I was building. Friday afternoon, I stopped by the bank in person to add an additional security layer to my new account. The teller printed the confirmation slip, the paper warm in my hand. Walking back to my car, the sky was pale and bright, the air dry enough to make my throat tighten. I felt lighter, though my pace was steady. That evening, Paul mentioned over dinner that he might be traveling more in the next month. We're expanding into Fort Collins, he said, like it was news. I'll probably be gone a few days at a time. I smiled politely. Sounds like you've got a lot on your plate. He took my tone as agreement. I let him, because while he was planning his next trip, I was planning my next move. So, if you had the choice to confront someone who's been undermining you for years, would you do it immediately and risk losing the advantage, or wait until the moment you could take everything they didn't think you'd dare touch? Over the next week, I moved like a shadow through my own life. By day, I handled the same small tasks I'd always done. Ordering supplies, answering emails, smoothing over minor client concerns. But under that cover, I was piecing together a complete record of my role in coal commercial services from the very beginning. Every document went into two places, the encrypted drive Sandra set up and a physical binder I kept locked in the trunk of my car. Sandra called it a firewall he can't breach. On Tuesday, I met her at a small coffee shop on the edge of town. The place smelled of cinnamon and burnt espresso. We sat in a corner booth, the folder between us, our voices low. "You've got enough here to prove not just ownership, but active management," she said, flipping through the neatly tabbed sections. "He can't argue you were just helping out." "That's the point?" I said. "No more rewriting my history." She closed the folder and slid it back across the table. "When you move, you need to move all at once." I know. Wednesday night I tested that theory. After Paul fell asleep, I went to the home office and opened the file cabinet he thought only he had the key to. Turns out, he'd never changed the lock from the day we bought it. I'd had the spare for years. Inside were contracts from the last 2 years, including the Fort Collins expansion deal. I read each page slowly, my fingertip tracing the lines that mentioned financing. My eyes caught on one clause: funds to be drawn from existing equity holdings. No specification on whose. I made copies of the entire packet using the office scanner, the machine's light flashing in slow, quiet passes. When I was done, I put everything back exactly as I'd found it. Thursday afternoon, I visited our accountant under the pretext of clarifying a tax question. In reality, I was confirming which company assets were liquid, which were tied up, and, most importantly, what could be sold quickly. His answers painted a map in my head of exactly how far my leverage could stretch. By Friday, the binder in my car was heavier, its spine thick with paper. I'd added labels for each section: ownership, operations, finance, contributions, proof, evidence, ammunition. Paul came home late that night, smelling faintly of whiskey and cologne. He dropped his keys on the counter and asked if I wanted to go over the Fort Collins plans with him. "Not tonight," I said. He shrugged, heading for the stairs. "Suit yourself." I waited until I heard the bedroom door close before pulling the binder out from under my coat and setting it on the table. I opened it to the notarized ownership document, then flipped to the bank statements showing the withdrawals for Jenna's jewelry and hotel stays. Two different worlds, side by side. The wind picked up outside, rattling the bare branches against the kitchen window. I listened to it for a long time, letting the sound settle into the edges of my thoughts. I wasn't nervous anymore. The plan was no longer just in my head. It was real, documented, ready. All I had to do was choose the day. And when I did, Paul would realize too late that every step he thought I'd taken backward was actually me lining up the perfect shot. It happened on a Thursday evening, 2 weeks after the rooftop. Paul had texted earlier in the day, short, clip if, need to talk tonight. Important. No smiley face, no preamble. Just a command. I waited in the living room, the binder on the coffee table, its black cover neat and unassuming. Outside, the sky was the dull silver of late winter, the wind carrying a fine mist that tapped against the windows. The smell of rain seeped in every time the furnace kicked on. The garage door groaned open. A few seconds later, his footsteps crossed the tile of the mudroom, then the soft thud of his shoes hitting the mat. He walked in wearing his navy suit, tie loosened, eyes sharp with something between irritation and suspicion. "You've been busy," he said, glancing at the coffee table. "What's this?" I didn't move. "Sit down." His eyebrows lifted, but he dropped into the armchair across from me. I reached for the binder and opened it to the first page, the notarized ownership document. My name clear and alone on the line. 15%, I said. Bought with my house and my inheritance. Fully vested, no conditions. Paul's gaze flicked over the page, then back to me. "I know what it says. What's your point?" My point is, I said, turning the page to the next section. Vendor contracts, payroll approvals, supply orders with my signature. I'm not just a figurehead. I've been active in this business since day one. These aren't favors I did for you. They're management decisions. He leaned back, folding his arms. You're dragging this out to prove what? That you matter. That I own what you keep pretending is yours alone. He scoffed. This is ridiculous, Marianne. I slid the bank statements across the table. Eyes it. Because these show company equity being used for personal expenses. None of which I approved. Jewelry, hotels, spa packages. His jaw tightened. You've been going through the accounts. They're my accounts too? Silence pressed into the room. The only sound was the faint patter of rain against the glass. I leaned forward, my elbows on my knees. You can keep smiling at your investors. You can keep letting Jenna answer emails meant for me. But from now on, you'll do it without my money. His eyes narrowed. What does that mean? I've begun the process to sell my stake. The words landed between us, solid and irreversible. You can't. He started. I can. The ownership terms allow it without your approval. And I've already spoken to people who'd be interested. People you'd rather not answer to. For the first time, he didn't have a ready reply. He stared at me, calculating. The sound of the furnace kicking on filled the gap, the warm air whispering through the vents. You'd sink your own investment just to hurt me? He asked finally. No, I said. I'd protect my investment from someone who's been using it to fund his side projects. His mouth opened, then closed again. I could see the moment the realization hit. That the leverage he thought he had was gone, replaced by something he couldn't control. I closed the binder, the snap of it loud in the stillness. You wanted to talk. Now you know where I stand. Paul sat there, motionless, as I stood and carried the binder back to the hall closet. When I came back, he was staring out the window at the rain, jaw set, hands gripping the arms of the chair. It was the first time in years I'd seen him look cornered. The rain had picked up, drumming a steady rhythm against the glass. Paul didn't move at first. His reflection in the window looked older, harder, like a man who'd just realized the ground beneath him wasn't solid anymore. You're bluffing? He said finally, his voice low. I stayed standing. You've known me long enough to know I don't bluff. He turned from the window. Do you have any idea what this will do? To me? To the company? To the company. I let out a short laugh. You mean the one you've been stripping for parts, while telling everyone I'm just helping out sometimes. His jaw twitched. You're overreacting. No, Paul. I'm reacting exactly as someone with proof, leverage, and a choice should. He stood, closing the distance between us. If you sell your stake, you're letting strangers into something we built together. That's the thing. I said, meeting his eyes without flinching. We didn't build it together anymore. You pushed me out a long time ago. All I'm doing now is making it official. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The rain kept falling, a soft roar against the siding. Somewhere in the kitchen, the fridge hummed and clicked. Paul's voice softened, almost persuasive. What can work this out? I'll make sure you're more involved. Stop, I said, raising a hand. This isn't about invitations to dinners or sicking me on emails. This is about respect, about the fact that you've been making decisions with assets that aren't yours alone, and you've been using those assets to entertain. He looked away, but not fast enough to hide the flicker in his expression. I stepped closer, just enough for him to feel the shift. I'm giving you a chance to step back, clean it up, and negotiate with me in good faith. But if you push this, I'll make sure the buyers I'm speaking to know exactly what they're walking into. Paul's voice dropped to a whisper. You'd ruin me. I shook my head. No, Paul. You did that yourself. I'm just refusing to go down with you. He stared at me, something calculating behind his eyes. You think you're untouchable. I think I'm prepared. The binder was back in the closet, but I didn't need it in my hands for him to know it was there, ready. The silence between us was thick enough to feel. Finally, he stepped back, running a hand through his hair. What do you want? There it was, the question he should have asked years ago. I want control of my stake. I want all future financial decisions involving company equity to be approved in writing by both of us, and I want a formal acknowledgement of my role, past and present. He laughed once, bitter. So you get the money, the power, and the credit. I didn't smile. Exactly. He looked at me for a long time, then nodded once, slow, grudging. I'll have the papers drawn up. Good, I said. Because if I don't have them in my hands within 2 weeks, I move forward with the sale. He didn't argue. He just walked past me toward the stairs, his footsteps heavy against the wood. I listened until they faded, then sank into the chair he'd left. The rain outside had eased to a soft patter. In the quiet, I realized my hands weren't shaking. My breathing was steady. The knot in my chest, the one that had been there for months, was gone. For the first time in a long time, the room felt like mine. The next morning, the house felt different. It wasn't quieter. Paul still moved around upstairs, opening drawers, the shower running for too long. But the air between us had changed. Less like fog, more like a cold, clear morning where you can see everything exactly as it is. I made coffee before he came down. The smell filled the kitchen, grounding me in something simple. When he entered, Ty already nodded. He didn't meet my eyes. Morning, he said, voice flat. Morning, I answered, setting my mug on the counter. He grabbed his travel mug and left without another word. The door clicked shut, and I was alone with the hum of the fridge and the faint ticking of the wall clock. I stood there for a long moment, letting the stillness settle over me. By 9, I was at the kitchen table with the binder open again. Not because I needed to check anything, but because I could. The papers didn't feel like weight anymore. They felt like armor. Around noon, Sandra called. How's the mood over there? She asked. Controlled, I said. She laughed softly. That's better than tense. It's both, I admitted, glancing toward the window. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked at the mail truck, tail wagging like it had no idea about the politics inside this house. You holding your ground? She asked. More than that, I said. I'm comfortable in it. After we hung up, I took a slow walk through the downstairs. The living room, with its neatly arranged furniture, looked the same as always. But I noticed things I hadn't before. How my framed degrees hung lower than the photos from Paul's business awards. How the bookshelf was filled with binders of his deals and none of mine. I made a mental note to change that. By late afternoon, I was at my desk sorting through more old files. The light outside shifted to gold, spilling across the stacks of paper. It felt almost indulgent, working on my terms with no one hovering, no one dismissing the hours I put in. At 5:42, Paul's car pulled into the driveway. I didn't move to greet him. He came in, set his keys down, and muttered something about dinner. I said I'd already eaten. He didn't push. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he'd realized I wasn't moving back into the shadows. After he disappeared upstairs, I sat at the table a little longer, sipping tea and listening to the muted sounds of the house. Water running in the bathroom, the creak of the floorboards as he crossed the hall. For the first time, it didn't feel like those sounds dictated my evening. It struck me then the calm after a storm isn't always relief. Sometimes it's just space to decide what comes next. And for the first time in years, that decision was mine alone. The weekend came without ceremony. Paul worked most of Saturday, leaving early with barely a nod. I didn't ask where he was going. I didn't care. The quiet was mine now, and I intended to use it. I spent the morning rearranging the office. The framed awards he'd lined across the wall came down. In their place, I hung my diplomas, the first check the company ever received, and a photo from the early days. me in jeans and a windbreaker, standing beside our first project site. The wind had been cold that day, my cheeks pink, but my smile was wide. I wanted that version of me in sight again. By noon, I'd cleared a shelf for the binder, not hidden in a drawer, not buried in a closet. Out in the open, where I could reach for it whenever I wanted. Armor doesn't work if you keep it locked away. In the afternoon, I met Sandra at a small cafe tucked behind the library. We sat outside under a heater, the air smelling faintly of roasted beans and fresh bread. She noticed the change in me before I said a word. "You're lighter," she said, stirring her tea. "I'm done tiptoeing," I replied. "If he wants to make this a fight, I'm ready." Sandra's smile was quick and knowing. "You already won the first round. Now it's about holding the ground." We talked about next steps. Legal paperwork, financial safeguards, the slow, deliberate building of a life that couldn't be rewritten by anyone else. It felt less like plotting and more like designing. When I got home, Paul's car was in the driveway. He was in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with his phone in hand. "Where were you?" he asked. "Out," I said simply, setting my bag down. His eyes narrowed, like he was trying to read between words that weren't there. "We need to figure out what we're telling people." I poured a glass of water, the sound of it filling the space between us. "Tell them the truth. That we're making changes." He didn't like that answer. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened. But he didn't push. Maybe he understood the balance had shifted. Maybe he knew there were more papers in that binder than he could counter. That night, I sat by the window with the lights off, watching the quiet street. The lamplight spilled across the pavement, catching the glint of frost beginning to form. Paul moved through the house somewhere behind me, his footsteps muffled. I didn't look back. The calm wasn't perfect. It carried an edge, the kind that keeps you alert. But it was steady. And steadiness was more than I'd had in a long time. I realized then that the real fallout wasn't loud. It was the moment the other person knew they couldn't erase you, no matter how many people they tried to convince otherwise. And in that silence, I felt the first true breath of freedom. Spring came late that year. In March, the snow finally receded from the curbs, revealing pale grass and sidewalks still scarred from salt. I'd been walking more lately, letting the sharp air clear my head before starting the day. The streets felt different under my feet. Not because they'd changed, but because I had. It had been 4 months since that night in the living room. The binder between us like a loaded question. 4 months since Paul realized I wasn't bluffing. We'd signed the new agreements 2 weeks later. Every clause I'd asked for, in writing, with his signature beside mine. He didn't look at me much during the meeting, but his pen didn't hesitate. Afterward, I opened my own account at a second bank and moved my stakes returns there. No shared access. No streamlining the brand. My name, my control. But the biggest change wasn't in the paperwork. It was in what I chose to do with the space I'd carved back for myself. In April, I signed a lease on a narrow brick building downtown. The windows had been painted over years ago, and dust lay thick on the hardwood floors. But when I stepped inside, I could see it: rows of desks, sunlight spilling across them, women talking in low, focused voices, the hum of ideas taking shape. I called it Foundry. A place where women could build something from nothing, where no one would tell them they were helping out sometimes. The first month, we had 6 members. By the third, we had 18, and the sound of keyboards and laughter filled the rooms. I taught a weekly workshop on financial management. How to read contracts, how to spot the clauses that could cost you, how to make sure your name was where it should be. Some women came in with start-up ideas. Others just wanted to reclaim a skill they'd been told didn't matter anymore. I saw pieces of myself in all of them. Paul didn't ask many questions about Foundry. I think he understood it was territory he couldn't touch. Sometimes I'd catch him glancing at the flyers on my desk at home, the ones listing upcoming events. He never said anything. Maybe that was for the best. Sandra became my unofficial co-founder. She handled the numbers when I was knee-deep in member onboarding, and I handled the member disputes when she was buried in spreadsheets. We were a good team. Better than Paul and I had ever been, because the respect was mutual and the credit was shared. One afternoon in May, I found myself standing at the front window of Foundry, looking out at the street. The glass was clean now, the paint scraped away, the sun warm on my shoulders. A woman I'd met months earlier, single mother, part-time bookkeeper, was walking toward the building with a folder under her arm. She'd just signed her first major client. I could see it in the way she held herself, taller, steadier. It struck me then that the real legacy wasn't the company I'd built with Paul. It was this, creating a place where no one would have to fight for the right to stand in the center of their own story. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the windows open, letting in the scent of fresh rain on pavement. The binder still lived on my office shelf, not because I needed to use it anymore, but because it reminded me of something important. Proof matters, but so does what you do once you have it. Paul and I still spoke, mostly about logistics. The personal part of our marriage had thinned to something polite and distant. I didn't mind. Some ties are better loosened than pulled tight. I thought about the woman I'd been a year ago, tired, invisible, waiting for someone else to hand me my place. And I thought about the woman I was now, building something new, holding the pen in my own hand. The difference wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was steady. Certain. Mine. And as I locked up Foundry one evening in June, the last light spilling across the floor, I realized I didn't need anyone else to tell me I belonged. I'd already claimed it.